Good evening, everybody. We apologize for the slight delay in beginning. We had a slight technical problem. But we'd like to welcome you to a live webcast being broadcast over LaRouchePAC.com. My name is Matthew Ogden. I'm an editor with LPAC TV, and this is a regular Friday evening broadcast featuring Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Now, this Friday, we find ourselves at the conclusion of a very interesting week in view of what our movement was able to accomplish, especially in Washington, D.C., taking both the widespread dissemination and penetration of the fact sheet that EIR and LPAC put together on the background to Benghazi, Barack Obama's alliance directly with al-Qaeda by name in both Libya and Syria, which reached the very highest levels of the United States Congress and other institutions in Washington, together with a very significant press conference that occurred on Capitol Hill featuring two congressmen, Walter B. Jones and Charlie Rangel of New York, also featuring two very high-level intelligence professionals and Jeffrey Steinberg from EIR. Both of these subjects will be covered in the Q&A after tonight's in the conclusion of tonight's event after Mr. LaRouche's opening remarks. We will be following the regular format. Today, joining us in the studio for the discussion period are Dennis Mason, an editor from LPAC TV, and Lamari Navarrete Bedford, also an editor with LaRouche PAC Television. So with that said, I'm proud to bring to you Mr. Lyndon LaRouche.
Well, there's an interesting trend, and it is a bit complicated if you want to be truthful about the whole matter. And I think that's probably the best policy to follow in this case. What's happened is there has been a gradual breakdown in the process around President Obama, or maybe ex-President Obama soon. And this breakdown has undergone a series of evolutions, not an evolution, but a series of evolutions, and back and forth. Now, what has happened, and there are a number of key things to have to take into account here in order to grasp the picture. This is not a simple one-shot explanation. It's a complicated process for outsiders, not for me anymore, of course, because I've been in on this thing. But I think the time has come in the whole process since we began this process of programming to begin to show what the potential victory might be. There's no guarantee that this is going to work, because you have the British Empire and the Saudis and so forth. These forces are working against us. They are relatively in the world, they are relatively powerful forces, and therefore we cannot say that we've won the battle. But what we can say is that some very interesting developments have broken loose here. And so we now have a completely different situation. And if you want to watch how the game is going, as I say, over the real ball game, we have a real ball game going here. But it's whether we're going to win the game. That's still up for grabs. All right, now, what we have to take into account here is several things. One of the factors that's working now against Obama and company is the Benghazi issue. That the fact that we now months into this process, we had an event which was a 9/11 event, specifically a 9/11 event, a duplicate in date of the thing from 2001. A little smaller in scale, but the same thing. Obama and Obama's fakery on the issue of events in Benghazi has contributed to this process. The wear and tear on his ability to muster, the wear and tear on the whole process is now very significant. There are also things, apart from how we can look at this process as I just described it. The other side of the thing is there is a sudden change, again, in the trend on the economic policy. Remember, back in the earlier months, we were at a point where people were talking about a Glass-Steagall option in Britain and elsewhere. That has come back on the agenda now rather forcefully. I wouldn't say it's in any sense guaranteed, but it's very forceful. you have to see the intersection among all these characteristics. First of all, Obama can no longer conceal the fact that he is tied to Al-Qaeda. That is no longer concealable. This came out very clearly in one form, in one place, another form, another place. But the fact is, and on the case of our representatives in Benghazi, our diplomatic representatives in Benghazi, this thing is now exposed. The whole crowd that was involved in that, behind it, was Obama. Obama was the actual backer of this process, and the backers of this process of the Benghazi operation. What happened to our diplomatic representatives there? Yeah? So that is now being treated by McCain and others very much up front. And that is the one thing that can really break this thing wide open. Because it's now clear that Obama himself is an accomplice of Al-Qaeda. And that is rather an interesting development and might change a number of people's opinions about this matter rather rapidly. Again, no guarantee. Another side of the thing, which is also has to be considered very prominently, we have a new surge of Glass-Steagall proposals coming out of certain British banking circles, where they're not going with the ring fences, they're going toward an actual Glass-Steagall. And that changes it. Now, what that means, and this also will have the effect inside the United States on the economic policy. All right, what we're in is this. You have three elements in a Glass-Steagall package of the type that's relevant here to what we're doing now. The first is Glass-Steagall as such. A simple enactment of Glass-Steagall as defined by Franklin Roosevelt originally is the first step. Without that, you're not going to get a solution. What we have now is in Britain, and some leakage in continental Europe in this direction, but basically in Britain, a recognition that we need in Britain a Glass-Steagall solution. And they're rather emphatic about it. And it's not a hopeless cause. This can work. We need it on the United States side. Now, on the United States side, the Glass-Steagall issue is very important, but the driving consideration is coming from those forces which are raising the question of Al-Qaeda. The fact that we in the United States have been jobbed by a president of the United States who is tied to Al-Qaeda not only in the operations against our diplomats in Benghazi, but the same quality is running the entire operation against Syria. And it is him pushing this policy that is the actual master of the immediate threat of war. The immediate threat of war comes from an organization which is the so-called freedom fighters in Syria. They are Al-Qaeda. Now, what this means to me and to others who are rather experts in this aspect of the thing, this whole operation is a British-Saudi operation. I mean the whole operation. I mean the number one, 9/11 number one, and 9/11 number two are the same thing. And this gentleman, our dear president, is an accomplice in both cases, in Syria and in the Benghazi effort, and it shows that the trace goes back to the original overthrow of Gaddafi. It's all one package. Now, this is the issue which is coming out more or less clearly in what is going on in the Republican ranks in particular, but in the Congress generally. So now you have a criminal action, evidence of a crime committed by the incumbent president of the United States, a crime that goes back to the British and to the British influence in this, and also other things. So this is all one package. And now the question is, are people like McCain and company, a Republican, who are hot on the trout on this thing, are they going to stick to their guns? Because if so, Obama's candidacy for re-election is in real deep kimchi. And so therefore we have that kind of situation. Now let's look at what is involved with the Glass-Steagall side of this thing. Glass-Steagall has more than 3 different elements which have to be combined in one in order to do the job. The first thing, you have to pass the original Glass-Steagall Act as a renewed action, number one. But that does not solve the problem. That now allows you to solve the problem. Without Glass-Steagall in its original form, you cannot solve the problem. But you cannot solve the problem without going on a step further than Glass-Steagall as such. First of all, you're going to have to get a lot of credit organized. In other words, you're going to take the whole system of banking and you're going to separate banking into 2 categories. The thieves, well, some of these guys are honest, but mostly we know the thieves. The thieves in this area, and but then beyond the thieves, we have to say, well, but that leaves us not enough money in the regular banking system, not enough money in the regular banking system to launch a recovery of the U.S. economy. And we now have in the United States in particular, but similarly in Europe. In Europe you have hyperinflation and collapse of the economies throughout Western and Central Europe. So you have to do something about that. Central Europe, continental Europe, needs a Glass-Steagall solution. But they're less prepared for it than certain of the British bankers who came back a second time after going the first time for a Glass-Steagall solution for Britain. Now, I'm all for a Glass-Steagall solution for Britain. That's not one of my problems with Britain. They should do it. They need it. There is no solution for them except by doing that. It's a very good idea, and I would be very happy to welcome it into the club. All right. So that's the first step. But now you have to get a new source of funding, because once we have taken care of reforming a highly corrupted, hyperinflationary kind of system in our financial system in the United States, there's not much money left that's not so dirty that you can't trade it. So therefore, you're going to have to find a source of credit in order to lead a credit program which will enable you to finance a recovery. And that gets kind of interesting, because what that means is money as such has no independent integrity. Money as such. What has integrity in this kind of system is actually credit. Now, what does credit mean? Credit means you're starting from a physical layer of productive economy, and you want to increase that layer. That is, you want to employ more people, you want to have higher technology, and so forth, because without that you do not have a generated economy. If we go down to the bare facts, without a credit system, combined with a Glass-Steagall system, you're not going to make it. There are certain things we can do. That's by using credit, for example, to launch other things in addition to the general Glass-Steagall program. So that's where we're going to have to put our heavy investment. And what we're going to do is we're going to do 2 things. First of all, there must be a credit system. In other words, the 3 things you have to do, you have to go to the Glass-Steagall, you have to establish a credit system, and you have to establish a program, a building program, an economic building program. Those 3 things are essential. Now, this has 2 elements. You have a lot of loose money roving around in various kinds of financial institutions. Some of this stuff is absolutely trash and cannot be salvaged. But you also are going to have private banking interests or private financial interests, which are more or less intrinsically decent things to have. So what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to take the credit potential in private banking potentials of all kinds. And we're going to use that or engage financial interests to use that credit in order to contribute to long-term development. Now, the principle here is, if you look at an economy rationally, competently, you see an economy has, forget the money part, let's look at the credit part. You have a certain amount of credit which is intrinsic in the present production, the present level and present production. That's intrinsic. You have a second one is that you have a future element. So you don't look at money in terms of just plain money or dividing money. You take two categories. You take the category of currency, which is in circulation now, already in circulation, and you have an amount of credit added to that, which is your commitment to realize growth, economic growth. So once we do that, that means we have to keep a twofold credit system. In one case, the credit system will be directly U.S. federal government credit, which will be the same kind of credit that Andrew Jackson destroyed and tore up. We're going to restore that to the United States. In addition to that, we're going to, however, find private interests, which are not just federal interests, but private interests, which also are prepared to support investment in expansion. So therefore, you will have a system of credit which will be federal credit, essentially, and then private credit. And the combination of federal and private credit, as it used to exist under John Quincy Adams, that kind of credit then comes into play. This creates sufficient credit in the system to have a general program of expansion. Now, we have two things that are obvious. One thing is NWAPA. The NWAPA project is the largest project which is fungible at this time. That is, we can launch this now. It will take maybe 20 years or so to complete the project. It's the greatest project ever undertaken by mankind. Then we also have things like the leftovers of the automobile industry. They're now trying to close out the last remnant of the automobile industry's role in the United States. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to say we need to bring back the machine tool capability, which was associated in a very large degree, or interlocked in a large degree, with the automobile industry and related industries. So we're going to have a credit system arrangement under the credit system in general that we create with the aid of Glass-Steagall. You have to have a credit system to rebuild the machine tool design capabilities of the United States. So we're talking about building up a very large increment of employment. Much of the population in this employment will not be very skilled people. But we're trying to capture, first of all, the highly skilled people who are either in retirement or about to go into retirement, because they're aged out, essentially. But their skills, their knowledge is very valuable to us. And therefore, the idea of getting people hired for new kinds of employment in the areas such as Michigan and Ohio and so forth, getting them back into employment, even though their skills are limited at present, we can absorb that. And we will need to bring into play immediately senior technicians who are capable of administering and directing the work. And so that's where we should be going. Now, there's another aspect to this still further, in addition to what I've just said. We put this planet back together again. We probably should be pushing for a breakup of the Euro system. It does not work and cannot work. It's a failure. And you find Deutsche Bank is being rated by itself and everybody else on the questionable value of some of their assets in these towers that they have out there. So we're going to have to rebuild the European system of national banking in European nations, because this potential Europe represents in the whole world economy is extremely important. It may not look so good on an individual nation-to-nation basis, but when you look at the whole process and see what the potential is there, you realize that it's extremely valuable. What this means then is that we're going to build a system which restores, if people are sane, it's going to restore the sovereign nation states of Western and Central Europe and rebuild them out of this package that was of theft that was done there. That will do it. And that's, I think, where we're headed. Now, this means that when we go to this idea of cooperation on an international basis amongst respectively sovereign nation states, that means that immediately one thing and the second thing. The first thing is it means a system of peace for rebuilding the world on a basis of a higher productivity and meeting the challenges which we should meet anyway in terms of things. And secondly, it means that we're going to realize that the possibility of general warfare no longer exists in this planet. It doesn't exist anymore. There may be odd exceptions here and there, but we're going to have to say that the question of permanent peace among the nation states of this planet Earth, that peace has got to be established immediately. Because any serious war at this time, because war, by the nature of warfare, is going to tend toward thermonuclear war. And there's no way that the human species can outlive thermonuclear war. It can't be done. So therefore, the very idea of a reconstruction of the type I've just outlined on highlights, that reconstruction is also going to be the establishment of peace. But with one other element here. The greatest threat outside of war right now, in terms of immediacy, the greatest threat to humanity lies in defense of planet Earth against things like large rocks floating around there, millions of large rocks of various sizes. And these things can, one of these larger rocks, which is floating out there, just looking for us, hits Earth, you're going to find a human extinction from this kind of thing. So therefore, we're going to have to immediately start moving directly into a Mars program, because in order to develop a system of the type we need, we must engage the capabilities of a Mars-Earth relationship to deal with that. So that means, again, that now the space program will be really immediately launched again. And this time it will have a very specific mission among its other missions. That mission is going to be to try to save Earth from the threats of these great rocks and comets as well. But we're not even talking much about the comets because we're not sure how we're going to handle that. But the general thing from asteroids, yes. We're going to have to organize with the aid of what we're building on Mars, various kinds of instruments and so forth, which are essential for this program. We're going to have an instrument development on Mars way beyond Curiosity. But Curiosity is an example of this. We're going to have to restore NWAPA. Put NWAPA on. We're going to put NASA back in the picture. And these great projects will be among the great driver programs for humanity. These conditions are such, with the fact that Obama is now tagged as being tied into 9/11 in the terrorist domain, together with the Saudis and others in Qatar and so on. So that has to be cleaned out. This thing has to be rearranged. And we're going to have to build up two basic defense mechanisms. One, against these asteroids and things of that type, which are a threat to mankind. We just missed one recently, or they missed us somehow recently. And also we're going to have to develop a system of economy which will be more than global. It will include Mars. And it will be the system we need. And so therefore we are at a point where when you put together these elements, you put together the British bankers who are again pushing for Glass-Steagall. That's a plus, and that's real. That's realistic. When you realize that the whole system now is going into hyperinflation otherwise, you know you have no choice but to go with it. When you think about what the requirements are for defending people on Earth from asteroids wiping out whole city areas or even something permanent for humanity, we need that too. So we're now at a point where these things are necessary and they're feasible. And the thing that's really pushing this in our direction is the failures of the British and their stooge Obama. That thing is not going to work. It cannot work. The only way it can work is lead to an extinction of humanity. So that, therefore, there's a qualified reason to believe that we could come out of this operation successfully. But the elements I've identified, and I've tried to rush through this so it doesn't take too much time, that is the way we can solve this problem. It's available to us now. And the peace prospects in that direction are good. But right now we're on the threshold. If we fail to deal with this Obama problem, if we fail to deal with the crisis, if we fail to carry out Glass-Steagall immediately, because the immediate installation of Glass-Steagall is the most essential part in the whole thing to move this. Otherwise you can't move it. And that's where we are. So we have, shall we say, as Gabriel Heater once used to say, there's good news tonight, and there's also some bad.
Thank you. If you're just tuning in, you're watching a live webcast with Mr. Lyndon LaRouche. Now, just to emphasize what Mr. LaRouche just said, I would call our viewers' attention to some very significant events that happened in Washington over the past 48 hours. Number one, yesterday, two hearings that took place in the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee, particularly the one in the House, in which some very uncomfortable questions began to be raised, which were directly affected by the fact sheet that EIR and LaRouche PAC were circulating. And then also just a few hours ago, a press conference that took place on the Senate side featuring Senators McCain, Graham, and Kelly Ayotte, in which McCain asked the question, what did Obama know and when did he know it? So with that said, I'll bring Dennis Mason up to the podium to begin our questions. Dennis is an editor with LaRouchePAC.com, and he's going to pose the first question.
Okay. So as Matt said, the other day there was a hearing a congressional hearing on the State Department Accountability Board report, the so-called Pickering report. And there was really a potential for a lot of fight coming out of this thing. What was clear was that the unclassified section of that report has far less actionable intelligence than our own updated fact sheet, which Matt just mentioned. And we put that together all with material from the public domain. So now, we had saturated the hearing as well as D.C. generally with the fact sheet leading into this. And at that hearing, there were comments from several different representatives saying that the report was far too narrow. What needs to be addressed are the policy decisions which created the environment in which 9/11 at Benghazi occurred. For the first time, there were questions raised about the military which provided security for the Benghazi mission. And their relationship to al-Qaeda. For the first time, there were questions asked about whether the Obama administration had used Qatar as a proxy for supplying jihadists in Libya with weapons, whether those weapons were used in the attack in Benghazi, and whether those weapons are going to al-Qaeda in Syria today. So the potential for a real breakout has been created. It's visible in the Congress. Now, along with this, as Matt again mentioned at the beginning of this broadcast, there was a press conference with Representatives Jones and Rangel regarding an open letter that both of them have sent to President Obama, warning him not to repeat the illegal invasion in Libya in terms of going into Syria without congressional report or congressional authority. And it's interesting because both of these representatives are distinguished, but they've both been chastised by their own parties. Rangel was, Obama told him to just retire in this last election cycle. Mr. Jones was removed from Financial Services Committee by his leadership. So both of these representatives have failed to go along to get along. So the question that I have is that, even in the face of the party politics, like you have the whole Kerry process, which is going, so the party politics is still there. We have, as you've identified, an increasing revolt in D.C., which you've catalyzed and we've catalyzed with our national activities. So there's a potential for a real explosion. So if you would, I'd like you to speak to that, speak to the strategic thinking and leadership that's required for this end of the party system.
Well, first of all, you've got to realize that the principle of leadership applies. Do not take the total population and assume that the total population is the democratic voice. It is not. Most people in this nation have no conception whatsoever of what the solution might be to the present problems. And you would have a great educational job to try to get them ever to understand that. However, you have a number of a certain layer of the population, which is a small, within the 10%, top 10% level, of people who do have two things. They tend to be well informed, not always perfectly, but well informed, relatively speaking. And they have the guts to speak up. And this is understandable if you look at the way that our population has been handled. We have very relatively mass insanity, which has grown up since the death of Kennedy, assassination of Kennedy. We've had mass insanity build up step by step. You have a very large, some people say 40% of young people are in some category of insanity. What happened in Connecticut, for example, was a case of insanity. And that's how it happened. And nobody was watching the switch on a case that was about to freak out and do something like that which happened. So the responsibility for this so-called tragedy, the responsibility lies with the institutions of government of the United States, which no longer do anything about mental instability. And you had this young fellow, the so-called perpetrator, who was in a breakdown situation. But this is only typical of the potential breakout of homicidal insanity in people since when? Since Kennedy was assassinated. What happened if you look back about 2 years after the assassination of Kennedy, and you will find that the drug and insanity business was launched then. And in 1968, you had the march of mass insanity, a real fascism, the worst kind of fascism, of the Hitler variety. And since that time, the rate of insanity, has increased. One factor, of course, is not only the drugs themselves, the drug factor, but the fact that the drug factor was correlated with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was the greatest promotion of drug trafficking in the United States in that period, and since that time. So you have to look at factors, not general census of population. Yes, the whole population will be affected by it, but the whole population will be affected by leadership. That the ability of the population to function depends upon leadership, and also, of course, response among the general population to this kind of leadership. Now, what we've seen is the senior figure from the Senate who's leading this issue, in discussion of this issue, is willing to fight. And I've been watching this closely. Will he stay willing to fight? Or will he cave in? And there's pressure in the Republican Party as well as others for him to cave in. But we see also a march, step by step, where this is breaking down. The mystique of President Obama is no more. In the leading circles, among the people who make a difference, the people who have the guts and knowledge to fight. And when they start to fight, even though they be a minority, even though they be less than 10% of the population, their decision to do that can bring about exactly what is needed. It's all there. That's why I say today, as I said in presentation, there are certain things which you can be optimistic about. The developments in a trend of developments which go in the direction of accomplishment. But I would look at things like McCain, and does McCain stay with the program, so to speak? Then you look at the British bankers who come up with the Glass-Steagall line. They're right. They're absolutely correct. This is the interest of the people of England and Scotland and so forth. It is their interest. And on that, we have no difference with them. That's their right. That's what they need. They have a right to it. They have my sympathy on that account. But so therefore, that's the issue. We have the people with the guts and knowledge to be able to provide a leadership. If it means as much as 5 or 10% of the population, that's enough. That's enough. Because the rest of the population will take courage from seeing a leadership of people who know what they're talking about, coming forth and presenting in various kinds of fora, presenting the case for Glass-Steagall, why you must have Glass-Steagall. What is Glass-Steagall? What does it mean? What's it going to do for you? What about your jobs? What about your health care? What about these things? In other words, once you get the thing rolling, if it starts to roll, we have all the preconditions, particularly the fact. The fact is established that the President of the United States is an agent of Al-Qaeda or a participant in Al-Qaeda, which is pretty much the same thing. And when people realize that this is 9/11, Mr. 9/11 President, that's what it is. And this was run by a Saudi-British operation. That's who set it up. And you take the Bush family, the Bush League of 2 terms, and this thing of Obama, you've got 3 terms of president, already recently completed, or almost completed. 3 terms of president, not fit for human company.
I'm Lamari Navarrete at Bedford, for people who don't know who I am, editor at LPAC TV. And I have a question on the rising tensions with the soon-to-be deployed Patriot missiles on the border of Syria and Turkey. At the beginning of this week, the chief of the Iranian armed forces said in regard to these missile systems that each one of these Patriots is a black mark on the world map and is meant to cause a world war. This is very dangerous for the future of humanity. Also following upon those statements were the remarks of Russia's Deputy Prime Minister Dmitry Rogozin, who spoke on the potential threat of mobile naval-based elements of the U.S. missile defense system, saying that if they were suddenly to appear on Russia's coastline along the Black Sea, it would trigger the harshest reaction from Russia, and also a new arms race between the U.S. and Russia. The next day, December 18th, Secretary of the Security Council of Russia, Patrushev, expressed in an interview the understanding of Russians that the atomic weapons of leading Western countries are aimed mainly against Russia. And given that fact, he expressed that the strength of Russia's conventional armed forces is insufficient, and that the preservation of Russia's nuclear potential is priority. Now, these 2 Russian officials may not have mentioned the word Turkey or Patriot missiles in their remarks, but the situation is very clear. The military buildup near Russia's borders constitutes a threat. In fact, the Iranian military chief pointed out that any experienced military man would be able to predict the scenario in which the fire breaks out, so to speak, after which point nothing could be done to extinguish the inferno. In this context, over the past week, there was also a high-ranking U.S. officer who spoke in Washington, D.C. in front of a public audience. And he expressed the need for cooperation between President Putin of Russia, who he said would be essential to assisting the United States in a solution both to the crisis with the Iranians and also with the crisis in Syria in a way that would be peaceful. He stressed that a mutually supporting system had to be set up. He expressed that today the Russians see weapons deployed near their borders. Their only response under the present configuration is to heavily invest in their strategic forces. Now, given the policy of the Obama administration of supporting al-Qaeda networks, both in the way that the Gaddafi regime was overthrown and also in the way that the rebels in Syria are being supported, the policy under the United States under our current president is clearly not for building a mutually supporting system with the nations of Eurasia. The current policy fans the flames of war. Given that this is the case, what does the Congress need to do immediately in the days ahead, given that they're still going to be in session likely between Christmas and the New Year?
Okay. Well, the basic thing, the trigger is going to be the economic trigger, because nothing is going to work unless it has the economic trigger in it. There's no way it'll work. Which means that what is happening is you get some of the Republican spokesmen in these hearings that are coming into these hearings now, that if they stick to their guns, they are going to, first of all, come to the military question and the security question, because that's the hot box that you start with. Because if you say that the president is a criminal, that opens the gates for a broader discussion. And he is a criminal. He's a criminal in more than one way. So therefore, if we have a leadership in the United States, which may be, as I've said before, which may be a minority leadership, but it's the people who are the natural leaders of our nation. In other words, the idea that the average citizen is the person who makes these decisions, that's not true. We haven't developed the citizenship which is capable of responding to that. They have no knowledge of what economy is. Really, no knowledge. They know practical things that they can do. But they don't have any understanding of how this system works. They don't understand how the world economic system works. They're given a lot of pablum, a lot of junk, a lot of silly conversation, which isn't worth anything. It's incompetent. They don't know what a credit system is. Probably you can run the streets and 90% of the people in the United States will have no idea what the hell a credit system is. And if you don't know what a credit system is, then you can't use it. And if you can't use it, you can't save this nation. And Glass-Steagall is the first step. It's only the first step. But the thing that's going to do it is the fact that the President of the United States is a stinker. And the fact that it makes him a stinker, he's telling us we've got to fight these wars against Al-Qaeda. He's saying that he won the war against Al-Qaeda by killing... And now he comes in and says, I'm your leader. And people say, you're on the wrong side. You're on the enemy side. You were the one who brought Al-Qaeda in to Libya. You are the ones who brought the war into Syria with Al-Qaeda. You and the Saudis, and the British monarchy are the authors of this hell. You want us to trace you when you were responsible for the killing of people en masse in New York City in the original 9/11? And now we have another 9/11, and specifically 9/11. 9/11 by Al-Qaeda. 9/11 back in 2001, Al-Qaeda. Today, Al-Qaeda. In Syria, Al-Qaeda. Now, this guy can, our current president, could probably get some consideration the fact that he's insane. And as I said back in 2008, when I presented the diagnosis of this man's mental life, I said he's insane. He's a Nero. He is a Nero. He's a virtual copy of the Emperor Nero. All the characteristics. And he's acting, he's now in a sort of a political death throes. He's entered. Just like Nero, who went into political death throes and then committed suicide after sodomizing and then raping his mother, which is not recommended as a good, high-quality personality. And Obama has much of that same kind of streak, that kind of characteristic. So what is going to move this thing is going to be the fact that the American people are beginning to hate Obama for what he is. They're going to catch on and then see that this is not the bright star that's leading them to glory. This is the guy who's going to starve them to death, kill them in proceedings like in the Liverpool program of Britain, which is the same thing as the Adolf Hitler program, the initial stage of the Adolf Hitler program of mass murder in Germany. So this is the way it'll work. It'll work because a moral factor, and people can understand a moral factor quicker than they can understand an economic factor. And when a people sense that there is a moral issue, that they are being betrayed by immoral people who are beasts, and if they have any courage, they'll react on that basis. But the thing is, they first must see a possible correlation, even a desperate one, with the two issues. They've got to see a correlation between the evil, which is now manifest clearly by anybody who's paying attention to what Obama's been doing. Here's the President of the United States who went to war in violation of the Constitution, who is a cohort of Al-Qaeda, which was an original 9/11. And he's also a 9/11er, in Syria. And look at all the people who've got funny state material on their face from what they've been involved in support of Obama's program, the Al-Qaeda program. That's the way it will go. It will go in history. I mean, the most people in history, because of the Roman Empire and things like the siege of Troy, that people react to the kinds of issues that ignorant people can respond to. How can they get passionate about something if it's not within what they think is their comprehension? And the typical American has no sense whatsoever of how a national economy or a world economy works. So they cannot really react to that. What they'll react is to react to the moral issue. They found out they've been betrayed, and they have leaders among them, as in the American Revolution, leaders among them who understand the issues well enough to lead people in acting to deal with it. That's the way it'll work.
Okay, I'd just like to follow up with a question from an institutional contact who asked, Mr. LaRouche, this week, Russian President Putin gave his annual year-end press conference. In response to a question from Associated Press about Syria, President Putin delivered a sharp warning against any kind of replay of the disaster the U.S. and NATO wrought on Libya, leading ultimately to the killing of U.S. Ambassador Stevens and 3 others. What is your appraisal of President Putin's remarks and of the ongoing dispute in Washington over a Western military intervention in Syria to overthrow the Assad government?
Mm-hmm. Well, Putin has shown himself to be not an ignoramus, shall we say. He's a fighter, and he's caught onto the job, I think, with improvements gained from experience, including bad experience. And that's about the way it goes. Look, anyone, just think about it. Anyone who understands anything about the strategic situation over the period since World War II, and even before, But if they understand that, then they would be capable of dealing with the problem. The problem is most people in society are not capable of thinking clearly on these issues because they don't understand them. They've not been enabled to understand them. They're subjected to all kinds of misleading. And so what happens is in all warfare, major warfare, what rules the warfare for the majority of people is not the reason, it's the passion. Society operates in these matters on the basis of support of passion and the way passion is organized in a population. Only a tiny minority, a very tiny minority of the leadership in the United States, which that is actually capable of understanding these things. They can understand other things. And as I said on the previous question, they understand the passion, the issue of passion. They understand, they recognize something that they hate. And some people not only hate it, but they have insight into what the issue is. It is that combination of a nation feeling itself in distress, a population feeling itself in distress, which finds itself confronted with something it cannot tolerate. And only those who have the qualities of leadership, who understand these things, are capable of effectively organizing. You can imagine the so-called, the kinds of things like the French Revolution. The French Revolution was a horror show. Because why? Because there was no leadership, or very little leadership. And it disintegrated. And that's why you got the French Revolution and the effects of it. And you had, of course, enough corruption in the whole process to help the process up. But it was that. You see, if you look at France after Napoleon Bonaparte, you see the same thing. You see a different kind of problem, but you also see some positive developments, changes in the character of the society. Not a very good record either. But that's the way this thing works. It works on the basis of passion. Now, if the passion is wrong, if the passion is wrongly directed, you're going to get a disaster. That's the risk of a government based on passion. If the issue of leadership is wrongly defined, then they'll probably create a crisis, a chaos, or something worse, a horror show. So it's only when there's a coincidence between passion which leads and requirements of the population that the factor of the population's motivation to respond can come out in the positive side. But you've got to understand that. You cannot try to assume that a population in general, a modern population in particular, understands history. This population today, or the American population today, is probably has the least educated in terms of competence for a very long time. This generation, you wouldn't want to take to war. Our young people, you wouldn't want to take them to war. They're crazy. Most of them are leaning towards psychotic. We produce that with the aid of drugs, legalization of drugs and things like that. We produced it. But this is the problem of history. When you're dealing with an issue like this, it is the way in which the passion is organized. And if you have people who are intelligent, they may not have everything right, but they can provide a leadership. And if they are the leadership, then the rest of the population may play a positive role. But the worst thing you have to fear is chaos, because chaos is a nightmare. And that could bring on thermonuclear war. It's all ready to go. But we've had a fortunate in the fact that Obama is now increasingly despised. He has only a small fraction of actual leadership around him, and they are beginning to turn against him. And you're seeing, first of all, the people who are the more courageous, who are and the more better informed and more courageous, are actually leading the passion. They're leading the passion by reason. The general population is coming to reason by the aid of mobilized passion.
Okay, I want to shift gears just a little bit. I have a question from Ben Deniston in the basement on asteroids and scientific method. But before I get to the question per se, I want to say that today there was actually an exciting event. We had the transit of Venus, which we had a little while ago, a once-in-a-lifetime event. That happened again today as visible from Saturn, which we were, this is the first time that a deep space craft, we have the Cassini craft out there, was able to actually look at the transit of Venus. And there was some new science that was able to be done in terms of looking at the spectral signature and this kind of thing. So it's a very, very young science that we have right now. This is the very first time we've been able to do this. Also today, there were 3 major articles in the Huffington Post came out. One about defending the Earth from asteroids, one going through the KT extinction and asteroids defense for the survival of mankind, detection of large and middle-sized things, and mentioning the Tunguska event, which we have to invest in the defense of Earth in order to prevent that kind of thing. So that those articles also were published today. So to Ben's question per se, he says, Lynn, you have been recently pointing to the danger posed to the Earth by asteroids and comets. We know that asteroid impacts have been a regular part of the Earth's history and will continue to be in the future. We also know that impacts can be devastating to life on Earth. While estimates are that 99% of species that have ever lived on a planet have gone extinct, mankind has demonstrated a unique capability to potentially deal with threats like this by exercising his scientific capability and technological capabilities. Now, you have written for decades on the subject. Sorry, lost my place here. You have written for decades on the subject of science and scientific method, and on the destructive effects of the oligarchical system's attacks on scientific method. For example, you have repeatedly pointed to the fraud of the Isaac Newton Project and Newton's promoters, who attacked the historical scientific arc of Cusa, Kepler, and Leibniz, and instead introduced the fraudulent sense-perceptual conceptions of isolated bodies acting across absolute space and absolute time. Now, currently, we have to deal with threats coming from our solar system and beyond, such as the millions of undiscovered asteroids orbiting in our solar system, but our ability to truly understand these challenges is bounded by our scientific limitations. Do you think that false assumptions underlying scientific thought pose a particular threat to our ability to defend ourselves?
Yes, absolutely. We have 2 things that are factors to be considered. One is pseudoscience. That is the belief in what you see is what is there. That's pseudoscience. And you find that in the history of science that the progress means revolutions which are always based on discovering that the popular science of the period was nonsense. And that's what Newton represented. Everything that Newton ever proposed, was within about a decade had been proven wrong and actually intrinsically incompetent. So that's where the problem lies. Now skip ahead. Go to the 1890s and the beginning of that century, and you find some people who, including Einstein, who made some fundamental discoveries, including the antimatter reaction thing, which most people still don't understand, and some other things which were of the same genre. So the point, every scientific discovery of any importance is a revolution. Now that's a nice word, revolution, because it doesn't say the predecessors were stupid. And what happens is people adopt and project popular ideas or popularized ideas and adopt these things as if they were truth, as if they represented value. When the point is, if you look at every crucial discovery made by anyone in science. Huh? Or you can take another thing. If you don't like science, let's talk about classical drama. Because the same thing is true in classical drama. And classical drama has the same principle. So therefore, it is like Shakespeare is a revolution. His ability to craft drama is astonishing. And there are other people who have similar that thing. So these two qualities of physical scientific capability and the ability to create the phenomenon of the experience of on a stage of great drama or great music are the same thing. They have exactly the same qualities. They are revolutions. They change, like Bach did. They change everything in a whole field, as Einstein did. He changed everything in a whole field. And therefore, the issue here is you don't solve the problem on the basis of trying to make a step forward and saying, now I made a great discovery. It was always there. I always understood it secretly, and that kind of thing, right? The braggadocio. So the point is that every scientific discovery, which is a very significant scientific discovery, was something that no one had any idea of before. And therefore, the issue here is now, when we look at space, as Ben has raised this question, we look at space, and we say, okay, we don't know what the devil to do with these, some of these things. But we do know how to deal with asteroids, we think. But as I was discussing with Ben yesterday, the problem is we don't really know what we're doing. We are making certain assumptions about how the universe is organized, but nobody ever really tried to put together the plenum of these asteroids, which are particularly the part that's in between the orbit of Mars and the orbit of Venus. And we never really put this thing together. We just assumed that they were all mishmash out there is all waiting for us. And we were starting for a long period ago on what Gauss did in this direction. But you realize that there have been qualitative changes in the terms, qualitative terms in terms of ontology. And every great revolution in physical science and every great revolution in great classical drama is an ontological revolution. It is not a rearrangement of parts. We're now dealing with a point where we face a million or however of these asteroids stuffed between the Venus orbit and the Mars orbit. Millions of these things. That's the best estimate. We don't know how many are. We only know a relative handful of what these things that we're talking about dealing with. And we have no general program for dealing with this thing. We're going to have to effect an actual revolution in order to understand how to deal with this plenum of things between Mars orbit and Venus. And we just had a little shock recently about what could happen to us. So therefore, the issue here on science is you actually are making a revolution. You are bringing about a discovery of a principle you never recognized before or never knew before. And you're now bringing that principle into play. And therefore, you are giving mankind an insight into what a revolution he can make to advantage of humanity. Sometimes you make the revolution first and then try to find what to do with it. But sometimes it works the other way. But that's when we are. We're in a period where the stupidity we see, the pathological, that is the mental pathology, which takes over more and more of the youth population of this planet, in the United States in particular. The great rate of insanity among young people in the United States is actually horrifying. And there are great efforts to cover up how bad this thing is by many institutions. But we have a real bunch of poor unfortunates whose minds are not well balanced. And the rate of that is increasing. And the rate of increase since the assassination of President Kennedy. For example, take 1964 and look at from the death of Kennedy, look to the say, the middle of the interval to 1984. And in the middle of there, you find already the drugs, not just drugs, but fantasies of drugs, absolute insanity, dominated. And what you saw in the 68ers at Columbia and elsewhere, the same thing. These guys were clinically insane. They were already deeply involved in drugs. They were absolutely useless in terms of production, useless in terms of all the things that are generally important in life. So the point here is we have to recognize that a society that is going to survive or deal with the challenge of these asteroids is going to have to make discoveries of things they don't yet believe. Because the problem of how to deal with 1 million or more of these asteroids, no one has got a clear head about what it's all about. We should just recognize that we got a real problem because we know that there are a lot of these things out there. But how to manage them? Well, we can talk about ones and twos and programs ones and twos. Slow them down, steer them in this direction, steer them in that way, control them. But a few. But we're talking about millions. So therefore, we come to the point that we're entering a new world. For example, we're on Mars. Well, there's no one has yet discovered how to live on Mars. No human being. We know how we can create artificial systems, and they hope they will work. If not, sorry, buddy. But the point is, we are faced with situations which are unknown. Now, why do we do this? In my view, the reason we make these mistakes is because we wish to extrapolate on the basis of what we can pick up in textbooks that we know, manual textbook, learned utterances. And the fact of the matter is, we've never been there before. And we're going to have to find out what is there and what's been there and what will be there and how this thing works. Just like every other fundamental discovery we've made. And take Max Planck and Einstein, for example. Take their role in what they did. And that's an example. Take the work of Bernard Riemann, who was understood to be a genius by his contemporaries when he was a young man and died early. But the importance of Riemann's work did not come until the discoveries of Planck and Einstein. So therefore, we have to understand that we have to develop a scientific cadre of a certain kind to say that the future is not the extrapolation of the present, either in quality or otherwise. And we have to recognize that we have to think about what it is that's wrong. The same thing comes up in drama, in classical drama. Now, I admit that these days it's very tough to find a good classical drama. The authorship may be excellent. The intentions of the author may be great. The intention of some of the performers may be great. But the saying is usually a piece of crap. And that's in music the same thing. Music is generally a piece of crap. It's learned crap, which means it's going backwards, essentially. So that's the issue, and the issue is all one piece. The classical drama, metaphor, the principle of metaphor, the same kind of principle in discoveries of universal physical principles. Again, same thing. And all of these things involve discoveries of principles which were unknown to mankind before that time. And what stands before us now are principles which we have yet to discover in our time or beyond, which would never be understood without creating a discovery of that principle in time.
Well, that brings a conclusion to our broadcast tonight. That was the last question. I want to thank you, Lynn, for a very excellent presentation. And I also want to thank Lamari and Dennis for joining us tonight. Thank you for watching, and make sure you stay tuned to the LaRouche PAC website through the coming days, and tune in again next Friday at 8 p.m. Thank you again. Good night.